What happens when the apex predator becomes the prize? When the absolute power of an empire meets its match in the suffocating darkness of a southern forest? Tonight we journey into a narrative that will rattle the foundations of your understanding, a chilling chronicle of justice delivered beneath a silver moon. If tales of profound transformation and the ultimate reversal of fortune captivate you, ensure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, for this is a story you will never forget. Our setting is the autumn of 1858, in the deep, pine-heavy reaches of rural Georgia. The moon hangs in the sky like a polished, cold coin, casting jagged, skeletal shadows through the ancient trees that border the Blackwood plantation. The air carries the sharp, clean bite of October, but tonight it is tainted by a far more visceral scent, the iron-sharp tang of human fear. Senator Cornelius Blackwood stands on his expansive wraparound porch, adjusting his fine leather gloves with the methodical precision of a man who has spent his entire life commanding the destinies of others. At 52, he is a figure of imposing, almost granite-like authority, possessing steel-grey hair that glimmers under the moonlight and eyes as blue and merciless as a winter glacier. He's a man whose reputation was carved out of two singular traits: his political obsession with the expansion of human bondage and his terrifyingly efficient hunting expeditions that treated the forest as his personal killing floor. The mansion looming behind the senator is not merely a home, it is a sprawling monument to wealth extracted from the marrow of the suffering. 12 massive white columns support the grand portico, each one a silent sentinel representing a year of his ruthless political rise. Behind the polished glass of the windows, the warm golden glow of lamplight reveals a world of opulence. Crystal chandeliers that fracture the light, heavy mahogany furniture shipped from across the ocean, and the delicate sound of his wife, Margaret, playing the piano for guests. They sit in cushioned comfort, sipping expensive brandy, blissfully insulated from the nightmare that is about to erupt in the dark woods beyond their manicured gardens. The wealth that provides their leisure is fueled by the forced labor of hundreds, yet to the senator, these people are merely assets to be managed or, as is the case tonight, prey to be pursued for sport. He is a master of a world that believes its walls are impenetrable, never suspecting that the very system he built to control others is about to become his own undoing. The contrast between the civility inside and the savagery outside is a thin veil, one that Blackwood is about to tear away with his own hands as he prepares for the night's entertainment. "Bring them forward, Jeremiah," Blackwood calls out, his voice cutting through the evening air like a sharpened blade. Emerging from the shadows is Jeremiah Cobb, the plantation overseer, a wiry, hollow-cheeked man whose loyalty was purchased long ago with the promise of whiskey and the sanctioned use of violence. Cobb has served the Blackwood family for 15 years, a man who clawed his way up from the desperation of poverty by proving he could be more cruel than the system required. His face is a roadmap of scars and bitterness, his eyes reflecting the cold calculation of someone who understands that his precarious status depends entirely on the brutal suppression of those beneath him. He defends the institution of slavery with the frantic zeal of a true believer because he knows that without it, he is nothing. At his signal, the metallic rattle of chains echoes through the night as 3 massive bloodhounds are dragged from the kennels. These are not mere hunting dogs. They are specialized killers, bred and conditioned specifically to track the unique scent of human terror. Their eyes reflect a predatory hunger that mirrors their master's soul, and Caesar, the largest of the pack, bears the literal stains of past hunts upon his teeth. "Senator," Jeremiah says, his voice a thick, rhythmic drawl of a man who has traded his humanity for a position of power. "The boy has been gone since the sun dipped. He has a fair start on us, he does." Blackwood's thin lips curve into a gesture that mimics a smile, though it holds no warmth. "That is what makes it sporting, Jeremiah," the senator replies. "Besides, they never truly escape. Fear has a way of making the mind turn sluggish and stupid." But Blackwood is laboring under a fatal misconception regarding the nature of fear. He understands fear only as a leash, a blunt tool of control to be wielded against the defenseless. He has no concept of fear as a catalyst for evolution, the kind of terror that burns away every secondary thought until nothing remains but a crystalline, diamond-hard will to survive and be free. He sees his quarry as a panicked animal, unable to comprehend that tonight the rules of the game have been rewritten. He believes the hunt will end, as it always has, with a broken man dragged back in chains to serve as a gruesome example. He does not yet know that the man he is hunting has already shed his chains and is waiting for him in the shadows of the pines. The man they are hunting is Marcus Washington. While the senator calls him a boy, Marcus is a 35-year-old force of nature, standing 6 feet tall and weighing nearly 300 pounds. He possesses a physical presence that is matched only by his hidden intellect. Marcus was born into the dirt of this plantation, the son of a woman who perished giving him life, and a father whose name was never whispered. What makes Marcus truly dangerous, however, is not his strength, but his mind. In the quiet, stolen hours of his youth, he had learned to read in secret from the senator's own daughter before she moved away. He spent decades observing the machinery of power that governed the plantation, mapping the psychology of his oppressors. He saw how violence was utilized to maintain the illusion of order, but he also saw the cracks in the facade, the moments when the masters revealed their own fragility. Marcus had spent his life becoming a student of the landscape and the men who claimed to own it, waiting for the singular moment when his internal fire would match the external opportunity to strike back at the world that tried to crush him. The decision to run was not born of sudden panic, but of a protective rage. Earlier that evening, while serving brandy in the senator's study, Marcus had overheard the casual negotiation for the sale of his younger sister, Sarah. The men spoke of her as if she were a head of cattle, debating her value and her breeding potential with a clinical detachment that turned Marcus's blood to ice. Sarah was only 19, a gentle soul who quilted stories of hope into her blankets and dreamed of a life beyond the rows of cotton. The thought of her being sold to a notorious Alabama plantation where women were treated with legendary brutality was the final spark. That rage burned away 35 years of conditioned caution. Marcus didn't just run, he transitioned. He moved into the forest not as a fugitive, but as a strategist. He knew every creek, every deceptive patch of quicksand, and every ancient Cherokee trail. He knew the land better than the men who held the deeds to it. As the hunting party mounted their horses and lit their torches, Marcus was already miles ahead, not running away, but preparing a battlefield where the hunter's weapons would mean nothing. The hunting party plunged into the emerald darkness of the Georgia backcountry with the boisterous arrogance of men who believed the world was their personal playground. 8 riders, illuminated by the flickering orange tongues of pine-knot torches, carved a path through the underbrush, their laughter echoing hollowly against the ancient timber. Among the guests was Judge William Crawford, a man whose physical girth was matched only by the legendary severity of his courtroom rulings, and young David Ashford, a 21-year-old aristocrat whose expensive silk waistcoat seemed absurdly out of place in the rugged wilderness. To these men, the pursuit was a social ritual, a high-stakes game of hide-and-seek, where the outcome was preordained by the overwhelming advantages of horses, firearms, and bloodthirsty hounds. They rode with the certainty of those who have never faced a consequence, their conversations revolving around tobacco prices and local politics, as if they were merely out for a midnight stroll. They did not notice the way the forest seemed to swallow the light of their torches, nor did they feel the subtle shift in the wind that carried the scent of wet earth and pine resin. They were masters of the plantation, but here, beneath the canopy of trees that had stood for centuries before their ancestors arrived, they were merely intruders. While the riders blustered through the woods, Marcus Washington had become a ghost of the forest. He had shed his coarse plantation shirt hours ago, coating his massive chest and limbs in a thick slurry of river mud and crushed pine needles. This was not merely an act of survival, it was a total immersion into the environment. The mud masked the heat of his body and neutralized the human scent that the hounds relied upon, effectively rendering him invisible to the senses of his pursuers. He moved with a terrifying fluid grace that seemed impossible for a man of his stature, stepping over dry twigs with the silence of a falling shadow. Marcus was not fleeing in a straight line toward the North Star. He was circling, weaving a complex web of deception designed to turn the hunter's own momentum against them. He had spent years as a forced assistant on these very hunts, observing how the dogs reacted to different terrains and how the riders grew overconfident when they thought the trail was hot. Tonight, he was utilizing every ounce of that stolen knowledge, transforming the forest into a tactical labyrinth where every shadow was a potential threat, and every familiar trail led toward a meticulously planned disaster. The first trap was a masterpiece of simplicity and psychological impact. Marcus had identified a narrow bottleneck where the main trail squeezed between two massive lightning-scarred oaks. Across this natural gateway, he had spent hours excavating a shallow but wide trench, carefully camouflaging the opening with a lattice of brittle branches, forest floor duff, and a layer of leaves that matched the surrounding terrain perfectly. Thomas Hartwell, the youngest and most eager of the plantation owners, was leading the charge, his horse galloping at a reckless pace to prove his bravery to the older men. The disaster struck in an instant. The horse's front legs plunged through the false floor, the animal's momentum converting into a violent, forward somersault. The sound that followed was a sickening symphony of snapping wood and shattering bone. Hartwell was launched from the saddle, his body colliding with the trunk of an oak, before he tumbled into the dirt. His scream of pure, unadulterated agony ripped through the night air, a jagged sound that instantly silenced the boisterous laughter of the hunting party. The confident rhythm of the chase was broken, replaced by the panicked winnowing of an injured horse and the frantic shouting of men who had suddenly realized that the prey was no longer playing by the rules. As the riders scrambled to assist the fallen Hartwell, the confusion deepened. The bloodhounds, usually so relentless and focused, began to exhibit signs of extreme distress. Marcus had prepared for the dogs with a series of false scent trails that would have baffled the most experienced trackers. He had dragged a piece of his old clothing, soaked in a mixture of wild onion and pungent swamp water, in 3 separate directions, creating a sensory overload for the animals. The hounds began to bay with a frantic, high-pitched frustration, pulling against their leashes and spinning in circles. Caesar, the alpha beast, lunged toward a thicket, only to find himself entangled in a hidden snare of vine cordage that Marcus had anchored to a sapling. The dog's angry yelps added to the discord, and Jeremiah Cobb's face twisted into a mask of disbelief as he struggled to regain control of his pack. Senator Blackwood watched the scene with a cold, simmering fury, his gloved hands tightening on his reins until the leather creaked. The illusion of total control was beginning to fray at the edges, and for the first time in his career the senator felt a shadow of something he refused to name, a premonition that the man he called property was in total command of the night. Marcus watched the chaos from a rocky outcropping 30 feet above the trail, his dark eyes reflecting the orange glow of the distant torches. He felt no joy in the suffering of the horse, but he felt a cold, crystalline satisfaction in the disintegration of the hunter's resolve. For 35 years he had been the one to flinch at the sound of a raised voice or the crack of a whip. Now he was the architect of their terror. He understood that he could not defeat 8 armed men in a direct confrontation, but he didn't have to. He only needed to dismantle their confidence, to strip away their sense of safety, and to force them to confront the reality of their own vulnerability. He moved away from the ledge, his bare feet finding purchase on the cold stone as he headed toward the creek. This was the next phase of his design. He knew that the senator would eventually rally his men, driven by pride and the need to reassert his dominance. Blackwood would lead them to the water, believing it to be a natural barrier that would trap a fleeing man. Marcus intended to meet them there, but not as a cornered animal. He would meet them as the embodiment of the very justice they had spent their lives denying. The psychological weight of the forest began to settle over the remaining riders like a heavy, damp shroud. The trees, which had seemed like mere background scenery an hour ago, now appeared to lean inward, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. Every rustle of a squirrel in the leaves and every hoot of an owl sounded like a signal from a hidden army. The men began to ride closer together, their eyes darting nervously toward the darkness beyond the torchlight. They were discovering the fundamental truth that Marcus had known his entire life, that power is often nothing more than a shared agreement, and when one side ceases to agree, the entire structure becomes incredibly fragile. Even Judge Crawford, usually a man of endless bluster, had fallen silent, his breathing heavy and labored as he contemplated the distance back to the mansion. The sport had evaporated, leaving behind a raw, primitive struggle for survival. As they turned their horses toward the sound of the rushing creek, guided by Blackwood's desperate, angry commands, they were stepping into a trap that was as much about the spirit as it was about the physical world. The remnants of the hunting party, now diminished and frayed at the seams, followed the silver ribbon of the creek as it wound through the jagged teeth of the Georgian Valley. Senator Blackwood, driven by a pride that had become a pathological obsession, led the way on his stallion, his posture a rigid defiance against the growing evidence of his own failure. He moved with the grim predictability of a man who believed that history was a script written solely for his benefit. He headed toward the Widow's Crossing, a shallow, stone-bottomed stretch of water where he had watered his horses for 20 years. To the senator, this routine was a manifestation of his ownership over the land, but to Marcus it was a glaring vulnerability. Marcus had spent decades observing the ossified habits of his master, understanding that powerful men often become prisoners of their own patterns. The hunting party, now reduced to 5 functional riders and a handful of limping dogs, moved with a palpable sense of dread. The earlier bravado had vanished, replaced by a suffocating silence that was broken only by the rhythmic splashing of hooves in the dark, churning water. The moonlight, reflecting off the ripples, created a strobing effect that made the shadows dance with a sinister, mocking energy. They were walking into a cathedral of stone and water, unaware that the altar had already been prepared for their descent into the abyss of their own arrogance. High above the crossing, perched on a precarious ledge of granite and moss, Marcus Washington stood like a dark sentinel carved from the earth itself. In his hands, he gripped a thick, braided cable of muscadine vines and hickory bark, a testament to the primitive engineering he had perfected during his stolen hours in the deep woods. The rope was the single linchpin holding back a massive accumulation of loosened shale and river-rounded boulders that he had spent the grueling afternoon positioning. Marcus didn't need the sophisticated weaponry of the senator. He had enlisted the oldest and most indifferent force in the universe: gravity. As he watched the orange flickers of the torches enter the kill zone below, he felt a strange, detached clarity. This was not a moment of mindless revenge, but a calculated correction of a cosmic imbalance. He could see the senator's steel-grey hair glinting in the torchlight, a target of arrogance moving through the center of the stream. Marcus waited until the sound of the horse's hooves reached a specific echoing resonance against the canyon walls, a signal that the entire party was committed to the crossing. With a single explosive heave, he severed the vine anchor with a sharpened stone. The silence of the night was instantly obliterated by a sound like a mountain shattering, a deep, visceral rumble that vibrated in the marrow of the men below. The avalanche was not a chaotic mess, but a targeted strike of geological fury. Stones the size of cider barrels crashed into the creek bed, sending geysers of frigid silver water erupting 20 feet into the air. The impact was a physical shockwave that turned the crossing into a churning cauldron of foam and debris. Judge Crawford's horse, a massive beast chosen for its stability, was the first to succumb to the panic. A falling rock struck the water inches from its flank, and the animal reared with a terrified scream, throwing the portly judge into the deep, swirling current. Crawford, a man who had sentenced hundreds to the cold stone of a cell, now found himself at the mercy of the cold stone of the river. His torch was snuffed out in a hiss of steam, leaving him to claw at the slick, unforgiving granite as the current dragged him into the darkness. Edmund Fairfax was struck in the shoulder by a glancing blow, his collarbone shattering with a sound like a dry branch snapping, sending him tumbling into the shallows. In the midst of this liquid chaos, Senator Blackwood managed to stay mounted, his eyes snapping upward to the ledge where Marcus stood. For a fleeting electric second, their gazes locked across the divide of status and shadow. The senator saw not a runaway slave, but a master of the environment, a man who had summoned the earth to testify against him. The psychological toll of the rockfall proved far more devastating than the physical injuries. As the dust and spray settled, the surviving riders found themselves standing in a graveyard of their own confidence. The hounds, once the pride of the Blackwood kennels, were now whimpering wrecks, their predatory instincts completely overridden by the primal terror of the collapsing cliff. Jeremiah Cobb struggled to keep his seat, his face pale and slick with river water, looking less like an iron-fisted overseer and more like a frightened child lost in a storm. The horses, sensing the profound lack of resolve in their riders, stamped and snorted, their eyes rolling in their heads as they searched for an escape from this cursed hollow. The torchlight was dying, flickering out as the men dropped them in the confusion, leaving only the cold, judgmental light of the moon to illuminate the wreckage of the senator's authority. Blackwood felt the weight of the silence that followed the roar of the rocks, a silence that felt heavy with the unspoken realization that they were no longer the hunters. They were merely witnesses to their own obsolescence, trapped in a theater of war where their money, titles, and lineage offered no protection against a man who had nothing left to lose and everything to reclaim. Marcus did not linger to watch the men struggle in the water. He vanished back into the timber, moving toward the high pine grove he had selected as his final arena. He knew that the senator, driven by a toxic mixture of humiliation and desperation, would not retreat. Men like Blackwood are incapable of admitting defeat to those they consider inferior. They would rather burn their world to the ground than acknowledge a peer in the shadows. Marcus felt the cool night air on his mud-caked skin, his lungs expanding with the crisp, clean oxygen of a man who has finally tasted the first true moments of autonomy. He was leading them deeper into the Labyrinth, a section of the forest where the trees grew so dense that the sky was nearly invisible and the ground was a treacherous carpet of needles and roots. Here, Marcus had spent the last 3 hours weaving a secondary network of traps, utilizing the natural tension of the young saplings to create a series of kinetic surprises. He was no longer running. He was inviting them into his home, a place where the social order of Georgia held no jurisdiction. As he climbed into the canopy of a massive oak, his heart beat with the steady, rhythmic pulse of a drum, signaling the approach of the final confrontation where the mask of the master would finally fall away. The surviving hunters limped toward the heart of the labyrinth, a place where the sun rarely kissed the forest floor even at high noon. Here the pines grew so close together that their interlocking branches formed a natural roof of needles, plunging the world below into an oppressive twilight gloom. Senator Blackwood and young David Ashford were the only riders still mounted, their torches sputtering as the oxygen grew thin in the dense thicket. The forest, once a resource for the senator's profit, had transformed into a sentient antagonist, whispering with every shift of the wind. Blackwood's face was a map of desperation and denial. He clung to his rifle as if it were a holy relic that could ward off the encroaching truth. Ashford rode behind him, his youthful face drained of color, his horse trembling at every sudden crack of a twig. They were no longer searching for a man. They were wandering through a museum of their own failures. Marcus had sculpted this environment with the patience of a master artist, using the darkness to amplify the hunter's inner demons. They moved with a paralyzed caution, realizing that every step forward was a step deeper into a trap that didn't just target their bodies, but their very souls. The arrogant certainty of the plantation had no currency here. In the labyrinth, the only law was survival, and the only judge was the man they had once called a boy. This was the moment where the hunter's hubris finally met the cold, hard wall of reality. The silence of the grove was suddenly shattered by the mechanical snap of a release. Jeremiah Cobb, who had been following on foot after losing his horse at the creek, let out a gurgling cry as a hidden snare of braided vine cinched around his ankle. In a blur of kinetic energy, a counterweighted sapling arched upward, yanking the overseer into the air until he hung helplessly upside down from a pine limb. His screams were rhythmic and hollow, echoing through the timber like a tolling bell of doom. Before Blackwood could even process the sight, a second tripwire triggered a heavy, sharpened branch that swung down in a wide, lethal arc, knocking another militia member from his feet and pinning him against the jagged roots of an ancient cedar. The systematic dismantling of the hunting party was nearly complete. Blackwood found himself alone in a small clearing with only Ashford, who was now weeping openly, his spirit completely broken by the relentless, invisible nature of the attack. The hounds, those bred-to-kill beasts that the senator had relied on for decades, sat back on their haunches and howled at the canopy, their predatory drive extinguished by the realization that their target was not on the ground, but was the ground itself. The senator fired his rifle blindly into the shadows, the roar of the weapon a pathetic attempt to reclaim a power that had already slipped through his fingers like dry sand. "Show yourself, you coward!" Blackwood shrieked, his voice cracking with the strain of a man whose world was collapsing. He turned his horse in frantic circles, the dying light of his torch casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to mock his movements. Then the voice came, not a roar of rage, but a calm, resonant baritone that seemed to emanate from the very trees themselves. "I am right here, Senator," Marcus said, his voice echoing with a dignity that Blackwood had never allowed himself to hear. "I am in the air you breathe and the shadows you fear. For the first time in your life you are looking at your equal, and the sight is terrifying you." The words were like physical blows, striking at the core of the senator's identity. He had spent 50 years building a castle of lies, telling himself that the people he enslaved were subhuman, devoid of the complex thoughts and strategic brilliance he was currently witnessing. To acknowledge Marcus as an equal was to acknowledge that his entire life was a crime and his wealth was a debt that could never be repaid. "You are property," Blackwood roared back, though the conviction had left his eyes. "You are nothing but flesh and bone I bought with gold." Marcus's reply was a soft, chilling laugh. "Gold cannot buy a man's soul, and tonight I am the one holding the ledger. You came out here to hunt a beast, but you found a man who has decided that your time of mastery is at an end." Suddenly, the shadows above shifted, and a massive weight descended from the canopy with the silent force of a falling star. Marcus landed in the soft pine needles directly behind Blackwood's horse, his arrival so quiet that the animal didn't even shy until he reached out and took the bridle in his massive, mud-stained hands. The horse, sensing the calm, centered authority of Marcus, stood still, its frantic breathing slowing as if acknowledging a new commander. For the first time, hunter and hunted were within arm's reach. Blackwood looked down, his rifle uselessly pointed toward the dark earth, and saw a human being. He saw the scars on Marcus's arms, reminders of the senator's own cruelty, but he also saw the piercing intelligence in the man's eyes, a light that no amount of violence had been able to extinguish. The power dynamic of the plantation was completely inverted. The senator sat high on his horse, yet he felt small and insignificant, while Marcus stood on the dirt, yet he appeared like a titan of justice. The silence between them was heavy with 35 years of unaddressed grievances. "I could pull you from that saddle and end this night with the same violence you taught me," Marcus said, his voice steady as stone. "I could let the forest finish what you started, but I didn't spend my life learning to read and think just to become another version of you. I am here to end the hunt, not to continue it." Young Ashford, seeing the standoff, finally broke. He threw his rifle to the ground and spurred his horse into a blind, frantic gallop, disappearing into the darkness of the labyrinth. Blackwood was now truly alone, a man stripped of his allies, his weapons, and his dignity. He looked at Marcus, and for the first time in his life, he felt the cold, creeping touch of genuine accountability. The forest seemed to lean in, the trees acting as a silent jury as the man who had built his career on the subjugation of others was forced to confront the reality of his own mortality. "What do you want?" the senator whispered, his voice a fragile thread in the night air. Marcus let go of the bridle and stepped back, his presence still commanding the space. "I want you to understand that your power was always a phantom," Marcus replied. "I want you to know the cold terror of being a thing instead of a person. And most of all, I want you to know that the sale of my sister is cancelled, not because you are merciful, but because I have taken her price out of your hide and your pride." The moon finally broke through the canopy, illuminating the two men, one broken and trembling in his fine clothes, the other strong and resolute in his mud and scars. The hunt was over, but the reckoning was just beginning, and for Senator Blackwood, there was no longer any place to hide from the truth of what he had become. The first hesitant fingers of dawn began to probe the dense pine canopy, casting long, pale ribbons of light across the wreckage of the senator's pride. Cornelius Blackwood sat on a rotting log, his once immaculate silk cravat torn and caked with the mud of the creek, his hands resting heavily on his knees. Around him, the forest was waking up. The birds began their morning chorus, indifferent to the massive shift in power that had occurred beneath their branches. Marcus stood a few paces away, his silhouette framed by the rising sun, looking less like a fugitive and more like the architect of a new world. The senator looked up, his eyes bloodshot and weary, seeing the man he had spent decades trying to ignore. "If I do what you ask," Blackwood whispered, his voice hoarse from the night's trauma, "I will lose everything. My seat in the Senate, my standing in this county, the very respect of my peers. I will be a pariah in the land of my fathers." Marcus didn't flinch. "You already lost those things the moment you entered these woods to hunt a man," Marcus replied. "The only question left is whether you want to lose your soul along with them. You can be the man who was broken by a slave, or the man who found his humanity in the dark. Choose." The sound of approaching horses and the distant shouts of a rescue party signaled the end of their isolation. A group of local militia and overseers, led by the grizzled and confused Pike, burst into the clearing with rifles drawn, expecting to find a scene of carnage or a captured runaway. Instead, they found a tableau that defied every social law they lived by. Senator Blackwood stood up, leaning heavily on a branch for support, and signaled for them to lower their weapons. The shock on Pike's face was palpable. He had expected a triumphant master, not this disheveled man standing as an equal beside his intended prey. "Senator!" Pike exclaimed, his eyes darting toward Marcus. "We have the hounds regrouping. We'll have the irons on him in a moment." Blackwood took a deep, steadying breath, his gaze momentarily meeting Marcus's steady eyes. "Lower your rifles, Pike," the senator commanded, his voice regaining a fraction of its former iron authority. "There will be no more irons. Marcus Washington is no longer property. As of this sunrise, I am granting him full manumission. And when we return to the plantation, the same papers will be drawn for every soul under my roof. The hunt is over because the system that fueled it is dead." The aftermath of that night sent shockwaves through the state of Georgia that were felt as far as the halls of Washington, D.C. Blackwood, true to the ultimatum Marcus had delivered in the shadows, did not merely free Marcus and Sarah. He transformed his entire estate. He became a man obsessed with a different kind of balance, replacing the ledger of human flesh with a system of fair wages and dignity. His political career did indeed crumble, and he faced the vitriol of his former allies with a stoic silence that many mistook for madness. But within the walls of the Blackwood plantation, a new legacy was being forged. The manor house, once a monument to suffering, became a vital, secret hub for the Underground Railroad, a sanctuary where those fleeing toward the north could find food, medical care, and safe passage. Sarah Washington, now a free woman, stayed just long enough to see the first of the Freedom Papers signed before Marcus escorted her toward the Ohio River. She would eventually become a renowned teacher, using her quilts, once secret maps of resistance, to teach the history of her people's resilience to a new generation of free children. As for Marcus, he did not simply disappear into the anonymity of the North. He became a legend known only as the Shadow of the Pines, a master conductor on the Underground Railroad who led hundreds of souls through the very woods that had once been his cage. He utilized the same tactical brilliance he had shown during the hunt, turning the southern wilderness into a highway of hope. Years later, during the twilight of his life, Marcus sat on a porch in rural Ohio, surrounded by grandchildren who listened with wide-eyed wonder to the story of the night the hunter became the hunted. He told them not of the violence, but of the moment he realized that the senator's power was nothing more than a shared illusion. He taught them that true strength is found in the mind and the heart, and that no chain is strong enough to hold a spirit that has truly awakened to its own worth. Behind him, on the wall of his modest home, hung a simple frame containing a piece of muscadine vine, a reminder of the night he used the earth itself to bring down an empire and reclaim his life. The story of the Blackwood Hunt remains a chilling reminder that the architecture of oppression is always more fragile than it appears. It tells us that justice doesn't always come from a courtroom. Sometimes it is delivered in the quiet, dark corners of a forest where a man's character is the only currency that matters. If this journey through the Georgian pines has moved you, if it has challenged your understanding of courage and the indomitable human spirit, then your support is what keeps these stories alive. Make sure to subscribe to our channel and share this video with those who need to remember that even in the deepest darkness, a new dawn is always possible. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our next deep dive into the hidden chapters of human history. Because the stories we tell define the world we build, and tonight we chose a world of freedom. Thank you for watching, and remember, the hunt only ends when the prey decides to stand.